Hi everyone, this is Miss Rachel again from the Lakeville District Library with another First Chapter Friday. Today we'll be talking about Orphan Island by Laurel Snyder, read with permission from HarperCollins Children's Books. This book is available on Hoopla, one of our free apps. You can check out 5 items from Hoopla each month, including books, audiobooks, and videos. Go to www.lvdl.org to learn more. This is the cover, and this is one of my favorite books ever. So it kind of reminds me of different books. It's a dystopian book about kids that arrive on this island. So every year a boat comes to the island and drops off one really, really teeny tiny little kid, like a toddler. And the oldest person of the 9 kids on the island has to leave in that boat. And no one else is like driving the boat. The boat just shows up and like leaves. And that happens once a year. And there's a song on the island that goes, 9 on the island, orphans all, any more in the sky must fall. So this book follows Ginny, who is now going to be the eldest orphan on the island. They arrive without any parents. They don't remember their parents. They don't remember anything but the island that they're currently on. And Ginny doesn't want the eldest boy, Dean, to leave. And she doesn't really want to be in charge of the new child that arrives. And she doesn't want to leave the island ever. So she kind of tries to break the pattern of what's happening, and there's consequences for the island. So this is a dystopian. It reminds me of a couple other books. One is Beyond the Bright Sea by Lauren Wolk, how it has kind of like the beach island vibes. Reminds me of Maze Runner by James Dashner, because kids show up one at a time without their memories and arrive to a group of kids that also don't have memories or their parents. It reminds me of The Giver because of like the mysterious like who leaves the community and what happens to them after. And then Lord of the Flies by William Golding, where there's a whole bunch of orphans on an island now and they have to survive. So this is the first chapter. Chapter 1, Bell and Boat. Ginny heard the bell. She threw down her book, rose from the stale comfort of the old brown sofa, and scrambled for the door. When she burst from the cabin into the evening air, Ginny ran. Along the beach, everyone was running, bolting for the cove, summoned by the golden clatter of the bell, so bright in the dusk. 8 kids, sprinting from the fire circle or the outdoor kitchen, emerging from their cabins, racing for the bell and the tall boy ringing it by the water's edge. It was like this every time the bell rang. At the cove, they lined up, breathless and staring out to sea, to watch the boat come in against the sunset. They stood waiting like uneven fence posts. There was Dean, who towered beside Ginny and now leaned to set the bell gently back on its hook, and little Sam beside him. There was thin Evie frowning at the lapping water as though it had done something wrong, and Oz and Jack jostling each other. June stood tall and straight at one end of the line, her gaze intent on the sea, and Nat waited patiently beside her, a book clutched in her hands. Then there was Ben, just a year below Ginny and almost exactly her height, smiling his easy smile as he stared out to the water patiently. Dean had been the one to spot the small green boat, appearing through mist that wreathed the island, cutting through the white-capped waves. Dean had lifted the bell and rung it to summon the others. Dean had been alone briefly with the knowledge that it was time for a changing. Ginny didn't think that was fair to Dean. After all, it was his turn to leave. He shouldn't have had to ring the bell too and stand there on the beach waiting alone. Ginny edged closer to him now. She took his cold hand and Dean gripped her fingers tightly, laced them with his own, but didn't turn to look down at her. He kept his dark eyes trained on the boat in the distance, so Ginny did the same. She wondered what he was thinking. He seemed strangely calm, unsurprised, almost like he'd been waiting for the boat, but his jaw was clenched firmly. In a handful of silent minutes, the boat slipped into the cove and nestled its green prow in the sand at their bare feet. Then came the empty before moment, the strange heartbeat of time when the 9 kids on the shore peered into the boat before anybody said a word. They all stared, at the shivering child staring back. Ginny knew she would be the one to speak first, to reach out a hand and help the kid onto the island. This one would be hers, after all, her care. Ginny was oldest after Dean and would officially become elder the moment he stepped into his boat. But she couldn't seem to move her feet. She didn't feel ready. Ginny curled her toes in the damp sand and squeezed Dean's fingers. He squeezed back, but then let go, leaving Ginny's hand lonely. She dropped it to her side. Last year there had been a boy in the boat, yellow-haired Sam, who now stood on the other side of Dean sniffling, always sniffling. Sam had belonged to Dean, had stumbled along him like a shadow wherever he went. Sam had shared Dean's sleeping cabin and been always underfoot, learning the island from the tall boy who would be leaving now so suddenly. This new arrival was a girl, of course. It was a girl year. Her eyes were huge in her face, stunned. Her chin trembled, and her black curls were damp with sea spray. The girl was pretty, but that didn't matter. Really, kids all looked the same sitting in the boat. Boy or girl, fat or thin, dark or light, they looked damp, lost, and snot-faced. The salt spray made their noses run. Now everyone was waiting for Ginny to say something. She was taking too long and she knew it, but it was hard to speak. She was frozen in the moment she'd been dreading for hundreds of sleeps. At last she forced herself forward. Her feet stuttered in the sand as she reached one arm stiffly into the boat, hand open, palm up. "Hey," she called too loudly, her own voice rang in her ears. "What's your name?" The girl stared at Ginny's hand. She opened her mouth and looked around, out and down the beach, then back at Ginny and the line of curious kids. The new girl shook her head ever so slightly. "Oh, come on," said Ginny. "There's nothing to be afraid of. Get out." She didn't want to have to reach in and grab. She didn't want to scare the girl any more than she was already scared. Everything would be so much easier if she stepped out on her own. The new girl stared at Ginny for a few frightened breaths, a few ripples in the shallow surf. Everyone waited. At last she spoke. "Mama?" she asked, staring wide-eyed at Ginny. Ginny shook her head. "No," she said. "No, Mama. We don't have mamas here. But it'll be okay, I promise. You just need to climb out now." She didn't mean to sound heartless, but the new arrivals always did this at first. Soon enough, the girl would forget about Mama. She would come to understand the island was, instead, the island was better. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, so Ginny took a deep breath and stepped forward, leaned in. She put a foot in the boat, and the girl cried, "Ah!" as the boat shifted and shook slightly with Ginny's weight, but it didn't drift. The boat never drifted. Nobody had any idea how the boat worked. It arrived at the same spot through the thick mist, as if pulled by an invisible string. Then it left again a few minutes later the same way. The boat was as reliable as anything, as sure as the stars. Ginny reached for the girl, gripping her under her thin arms. Ginny dragged her forcibly from her spot on the plank seat and up over the green side of the boat, and then swung the girl up onto her hips so she could carry her awkwardly back to the line of children, where she plunked her down heavily in the sand. Harder than she meant to, so that the kid let out a startled "ugh." After that, Ginny pushed the girl from her thoughts because it was time. The boat was empty, waiting. Ginny turned to look at Dean and frowned. "Are you ready?" Dean nodded. His lank hair shook in his face. "Guess so," he muttered. I guess it's time, huh?" He stepped forward and turned around to face them. He glanced up and down the line at all of them. "Well," Dean said, "so..." Ginny heard a choking cry. Sam broke from the line and ran forward, burying his face in Dean's belly. Dean reached down and placed a sturdy hand on Sam's head, but kept talking. Hey, I'll miss you, buddy, but there's no need to cry. I'll see you all again, on the other side, when your turn comes, right?" Nobody answered him, but behind Dean, the boat rocked impatiently. Dean crouched down to hug Sam. "I have to go, Sam, man," he said, "but you'll be okay. The others will take care of you." He looked back over his shoulder at Ginny as if for help, but his voice was flat as it had been so often lately, as though he was reciting the words. They didn't feel true exactly. They didn't feel like he meant them, not the way he should. Before Ginny could react, Ben stepped forward. He walked surely down the line of kids, lifted Sam in a hug, and carried him wordlessly away. Even as Sam sobbed, Ben didn't stumble. He walked steadily back toward the path and the cabins. It was wonderful, Ginny thought, how Ben always seemed to know just what to do. Ben was so good. She wondered what it felt like to always be so good. Anyway, it was just as well Sam left, thought Ginny. Nothing would make the next few moments any easier for him. And how many times could a person say goodbye? Eventually the sun would slip into the sea. Dean had to climb into the boat before it got too dark. Everyone knew that. One by one, the other kids followed Ben's lead. They hugged Dean goodbye and choked back their tears, or didn't, and straggled back to their cabins to eat or read or climb under their covers and sleep heavily. It would be a silent night. It always was. Dean didn't cry, so Ginny willed herself not to. At last the others were gone, and Ginny and Dean stood alone together beside the new girl, a tiny heap of person in the sand. So silent she almost wasn't there. Dean was still frozen, rigid and staring out, so Ginny reached up to hug him for the last time, wishing he'd soften, melt into his old self. She buried her face in his neck. She set her cheek against the sharp angle of his collarbone so that his hair tickled her cheek. She waited for him to speak first, her best friend, her brother. But he didn't speak. He only pulled away, backed out of her hug. "Oh," said Ginny. Dean was the only person left in her world who'd been here when Ginny had arrived. She couldn't remember that day, and she doubted he could either, but it still meant something. For as far back as she could recall, there had been Dean, exactly a head above her, her constant companion. Now he was leaving, and she would become elder, the tallest tree with the longest memory. She didn't feel ready. The mercy of a changing was that the little ones never remembered their own arrivals. Often they even forgot their elders as the years slipped by, all the hours spent, all the lessons learned together. The memories floated away with the sleeps. Ginny could barely recall Emma, her own elder. She only remembered a blur of red hair and freckles, a soft, breathy laugh. A tall person holding her hands so tightly that her finger bones hurt when they climbed the boulders to the cliffs side by side. In the same way, Sam might now forget Dean. It was hard to believe that could happen, but they were so young when all this took place. What they knew, all they knew, was the island itself, years of running on the beach, singing by the fire, plucking fruit from the trees and fish from the nets. Salt and sand and sun. They only knew the good of it. But for Ginny, this changing would be different. This moment would never fade for her. She knew that inside herself. She could feel it being etched into her memory. She hoped Dean felt the same. She looked at him and memorized his face, smooth skin with the cheekbones sharp beneath them. Had he always looked like that? Ginny didn't think of Dean as sharp. When had that happened? Ginny memorized the feeling of the moment, too, the grit of damp sand beneath her scrunched toes, the lapping of the surf, the salt on her lips. She licked them. Dean could pretend not to care, but she refused. "I don't want you to leave," Ginny said, shaking her head. Dean forced a smile. "Well, for once, you don't get what you want." Ginny frowned at him. "Don't say that. It's not funny." "It'll only be a year," Dean said. "Then I'll see you again." He glanced down now, made eye contact, but something in what he said bothered Ginny, and she spat out a mouthful of words that surprised them both. "You don't know that. You don't know where the boat goes. Nobody does. It could take you over the edge of the earth or into the jaws of some ravening sea creature like in a book. It's nice to be cheerful in front of the littles, but really, you could just sail off into the sea forever until you wasted away from hunger, couldn't you?" Dean stared at her now as though he didn't quite recognize her. "Well, that's a happy thought," he said tightly. "Maybe I shouldn't have said that," said Ginny, "but you know it's the truth and you don't seem to care. It's almost like you want to go away. Or like you're already gone. Like you've been gone. Why?" "Cut it out," said Dean. He kicked at the side of the boat. "It's not that simple, Ginny. I can't explain how this feels, not even to you. You wouldn't understand." "Try me," said Ginny. Dean shook his head. "I don't know how. Anyway, I have to get into the boat. Why do you want to go and make it harder for me? Why do you want to fight now?" Ginny's mouth snapped shut, and her eyes darted to the sand. Was that what she was doing? She didn't meant to. She had only wanted him to care. "I'm sorry," she muttered. "I just miss you is all, a lot." "Of course you will," said Dean, "and me too, but it's not like I have a choice in this, you know." Ginny bit her lip, trying not to say the wrong thing again, but she couldn't keep silent. "Well, maybe you do have a choice. I mean, you could stay." "Stay?" Dean squinted. Ginny nodded, glancing back up at him. "You know I can't do that, Ginny," said Dean. "Why not?" "Because," Dean's voice was gruff now, angry. "You know the words." Then he recited, "9 on an island, orphans all, any more." Ginny cut him off with a sharp laugh. "The sky might fall?" Dean shrugged. "That's how the song goes." "The thing is," said Ginny, "skies don't actually fall. Just look at it." She craned her neck, stared up into the reliably endless expanse overhead. "Did you ever see something so permanent? It's just a silly little song. Who knows who even made it up? Probably some elder years back to entertain their care. I could make up a song too if I wanted. I could even rhyme if I tried. She thought for a moment, then added, like this. Everyone must go away except Dean. Yes, Dean should stay. Ginny stopped singing. There, how's that? Now will you stay, since it rhymed and all? Dean shook his head, exasperated. Listen, Ginny, the island has rules for a reason. We have to follow them. Remember what happened the time Tate picked all the curly ferns, even though everyone knows you're never supposed to pick the last of anything ever? And then they never grew again. We were so mad at her. Remember how good those ferns were, and now they're gone. That's different, said Ginny. That rule makes sense. This one doesn't. Dean wasn't looking at her anymore. He was turned away again, staring down at the green boot. Stop it, Ginny. This is the way it works. I have to leave, and next year it will be your turn, so you better get used to the idea. What would happen if we all just stayed forever? I don't know, said Ginny, and neither do you. It might be fine. But it might not, argued Dean. And what if the sky did fall? What if it broke to bits? Skies don't break, Dean. Enough, Ginny. Dean's voice was loud now, and suddenly deeper than she'd ever heard it. Dean didn't sound like himself. He sounded harder, older. The boat comes when the boat comes. You can't just do whatever you feel like all the time. And anyway what? Asked Ginny. Anyway, said Dean, I might be ready for something else. Did you ever think of that? That I might be curious what's out there? He looked at the sea beyond the boat and squinted. Aren't you, at least a little bit? Don't you want to see what more there is? Dean's last sentence hung in the air between them for a long moment before Ginny said, Oh. She looked down at her dirty feet in the sand. Well, if you want to go, that's different. Don't let me stop you. You'll understand, Dean said, stepping away from Ginny. You will, when it's your turn. It's different. You'll change too. Ginny shook her head. She didn't say anything. What could she say to that? If she tried, she knew she'd cry. Dean had changed. He'd been odd for sleeps, and she hated it. Dean waded into the surf. I'm done talking about this, he said as he turned to the boat. His back was to Ginny. I'll see you when you come. Without even glancing over his shoulder again, he shouted, Bye! No, Dean, wait, Ginny cried. Dean couldn't leave like that, fighting. He wouldn't. But that's exactly what he did do, because the minute he sat down on the low plank seat, the green boat backed up into the cove and then turned and zipped away, in a true straight line, quickly out into the open water, back to wherever it came from. No different than any other year. The boat didn't know they were fighting. The boat didn't give them an extra minute to make up. The boat had some place to be. As he sped off, Dean turned to look back at her over his shoulder. He called out something, but what? Ginny could see his mouth open and close. He threw a hand sharply into the air, but whatever he said was lost in the spray and mist as they swallowed him. Ginny watched the boat disappear until all she could see was water and distance. It happened so fast. She found herself standing, reaching out both arms in the direction of the boat had gone, both hands with outstretched fingers grasping, as if there was something in the air she might be able to clutch.